I just want to tell you a little bit about the genesis of this talk. I had the temerity to call Sam when I heard about the conference because, as Mark said, I've had the pleasure and privilege of helping many Australians for years. I love working with your country. So I asked Sam if I could, sort of self-invited guest to come. And he said, what do you want to talk about? I said, well, I want to talk about what you want me to talk about. It's your conference, and I want it to be an interesting talk. I don't want it to just stand up there and blah, blah, blah about, how you do a surrogacy cycle and show you pretty pictures. Those great pictures Dr. Shabani showed. You can see our clinic on havingbabies.com and see, we have a beautiful video there. But I wanted to talk about something of interest. And so he then came to me and said, and he's going to expound on this more later. I don't want to steal your thunder, but there's been an internal survey of this wonderful organization of comparing Indian to American surrogacy practices. And of course, cost was a big difference, but it's all understood. What puzzled him in your own survey was this unbelievable finding, and that there was a 17% second trimester pregnancy loss rate in India in your group. Okay, so this is your reporting it. And that there is the typical 1% loss in America. So he said to me, what do you think is going on here? And of course, it's very tempting to start to be, chauvinistic and self-righteous and say, well, India's a poor country and these people aren't getting good care and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't say that, right? And I know that it's a lot better than advertised, and I have contacts in India. You see the pictures of the clinics and everything. And so I said to him, I've had a few patients. I can't speak with authority about India, and I don't want to presume too much, but I've had several patients go over there and come back if they weren't pregnant, to me, of course. And the thing that struck me is that they were putting in considerably more embryos than we were. And so my presumption was that not all of it, but a significant part of this number was due to multiple pregnancies. And that then tipped off Sam to really ask me to speak about this topic. So before I go on, I just want to say in advance, I'm not bashing twins. I know many of you here have twins. I know some of you are expecting twins. And when it works out well, I'm very happy for you. But you still need to know some of the facts. And some of the facts are that, for instance, the rate of cerebral palsy, the condition that comes from lack of oxygen in the pregnancy, when adjusted for prematurity, is 8 times higher in twins and 40 times higher in triplets. The prematurity rate in twins is 50%. Now, of course, that's a broad number because any baby born before 37 weeks is considered premature. So, it's a wide range there. But within that group, of course, are these poor little rabbits that are born, 24 weeks, and have to spend weeks and weeks and weeks in intensive care units, and you hold your breath waiting for them to hopefully survive. Fortunately, especially in the United States, neonatal ICU care is so advanced that many of these babies do survive well. But of course, like with all medical interventions on a delicate little creature, there are going to be some lifetime disabilities associated with these long periods in the ICU, particularly the effects of high oxygen and high tension respirators that are used to keep these babies alive because their lungs do not expand. And then, as I alluded to before, there is a higher second trimester pregnancy loss rate. It is significantly higher. Of course, people do lose pregnancies in the second trimester with singletons, but the difference is great. And it's a very traumatic experience. When we've had people that have experienced this terrible situation, because remember, you've got fetuses sitting in there, you go to the ultrasound guy, and you see the babies moving around, and these 3D pictures come out that you get, then they're gone. It's very traumatic. And when my patients come back after these losses, they're like shaking. Don't give me a twin pregnancy again. So again, as I'm saying, when it works out great, I'm very happy. I'm not trying to be sanctimonious, but you have to be careful. Now, I decided to give this talk straight out without the PowerPoint. I'm not a lawyer, and I didn't want to numb your brain with lots of graphs and stuff, but I'm going to describe some of the actual evidence that should comfort you in making the decision to put in less embryos. Whether you're in the United States or India. My talk here is not to bash India. I want to make that clear. My talk is to urge you, wherever you're going, to be cautious. And to urge my Indian colleagues to probably put a few less embryos in. I would say that. So, first of all, an interesting thing way back in the history of IVF is that the condition that was treated way back in the 80s, the primary reason that IVF was invented was not for you. It was for women who had a condition called hydrosalpinx, a blockage of the tubes that was very common in the 80s due to gonorrhea and chlamydia. And the ends of the tubes were blocked. And if you did an x-ray, you had these big sausage-like tubes, and they were containing these toxic fluids. And almost all the women going through IVF in the early days had this condition. And sure enough, 10 years later, very clever studies came out showing that when women had hydrosalpinx, their pregnancy rates with IVF were 50% lower than now the other couples that were doing IVF for other reasons with open tubes. So there we go. We already have one explanation for why success rates with IVF were so low in the beginning. That it was self-selected. The very patients who were being treated had poor prognosis. So what that happened, the first IVF cycles were done with either natural cycles or maybe a little lick of Clomid, and very few eggs were obtained, and that's what you got back, and that was the pregnancy rate. Then we got the idea of the so-called controlled hyperstimulation to produce the multiple eggs, and it was naturally assumed that the reason that the pregnancy rates were so low because you got to put more embryos back. And sure enough, for 10 years, you could see the graphs, 1 embryo, 2 embryos, 3 embryos, and then it plateaued out at 4 embryos. So it became standard of care to put in a bunch of embryos. Now, when I was in Australia the last time in 1999 attending the World Congress of IVF in Sydney, the gentleman from Australia got up to show a graph that the twin rate in Australia for 100 years was this, and then slowly the actual twin rate in this relatively small but well-developed country started actually climbing. You could see the twin rate, the triplet rate, climbing expressly due to assisted reproductive technologies. And this had a multi-billion-dollar implication on your healthcare system, and it was an area of great concern to Australians. And so Australians have actually led the world in cutting this back. And I think they've done it more prudently than Europe because they're not so rigid about it, but they clearly are pushing doctors to pull back. Now, another study that then came out that was very clever from England started to realize that there's actually 2 groups of patients. Okay, this is one graph I might have been able to benefit to show you. But what they showed you is there are 2 groups of patients. There's a woman who only made 1 egg after all the, we use Pergonal those days, but all the, whatever you're using, Organon, Pyragon, Gonal-F, whatever you're using, there's women that only make 1 egg. And there's women who make 10 eggs. So they showed that the success rate in a patient who only had 1 egg was that, because she was a very good patient. And the women who made more than 3 eggs, and you selected the embryo, had that. And sure enough, when they went to 2 embryos, the woman only made 2 eggs, and you selected from 4 or more embryos and could pick by quality, same thing. The pregnancy rate went up for the 2 egger. And for the women who made more and selected, it was significantly higher. And then guess what? At 3 embryos, they were the same. So the conclusion of this paper, and then subsequent papers that have emulated it, was that, again, if you can select embryos, you don't need to stuff the ballot box. So that brings us to then the topic of the day 3 versus day 5 transfers. All of these studies were done with day 2 and day 3 transfers. And so now we do have this so-called day 5 or blastocyst culture, and as I mentioned yesterday during the panel, it's somewhat misunderstood. It was never intended to be a better pregnancy rate thing. It was intended to be a better selection thing. So the landmark paper by Gardner and Schoolcraft, it's probably close to 10 years now, that's what they showed. If you did 3 embryos on day 3, you got the same pregnancy rate as 2 embryos on day 5, but of course the lower multiple pregnancy rate. And the subsequent studies that are similar to the English one I mentioned to you have shown that in well-controlled places that are very used to doing blastocyst cultures, a single embryo may give you a pregnancy rate close. I can't say definitively that it'll be the same, but satisfactorily close to a 2 embryo transfer. And then if you look again, and I can't even give you exact numbers, but the facts are there, that if you start out with a slightly higher pregnancy rate with the 2 embryos, that live birth rate is going to come down and down and down and down to the very day the surrogate goes to the delivery room and comes out with a baby. You're going to come out with less babies than you started with, and that advantage is going to decrease with a great heartache to you, the parents. So I would also argue that even in our country where it's a little more expensive to do this stuff medically, a frozen embryo transfer is not that expensive. You don't even have to come for it. So, you know, you're better off with a second try with those embryos than, in my opinion, than stuffing the valve box, either getting the multiple birth, and I also think, I have to say, I abhor the concept that we would create a multiple pregnancy with the express intent of a multi-fetal reduction. I mean, we all get caught, but we get caught. We don't go say, oh, well, we can always do multi-fetal reduction. You know, with the best intention, we get a higher number of pregnancies, such as splitting embryos and so forth, and we do it. But I think as a game plan, it's not a great game plan. And I'm not just being moralistic with it, I'm being practical, because, you know, freezing embryos now is pretty good. And there's a slight decrease in pregnancy rate, but it's not bad. And it's my firm belief that the embryos we're destroying at these procedures are the very embryos that would have come out of the freezer and made you one baby. And many people do want more than one baby, and I'm always amazed at how people will come back at the great expense, the great travel and everything else that you go through to even have a second baby, the surrogate. So those are babies in the freezer for you that are unfortunately being lost. Now, a few positive things I'll end with about twinning is studies show the following, that the socioeconomic status of the mother does affect outcomes. So twins and triplets born to women with adequate health care, nutrition, and all that stuff do have better outcomes than more indigent people. That might be a factor in what we're speaking about, comparing America and India. I don't want to overrate it, but it's true in America too. Also, it's been shown that twins born from IVF actually have a little better outcomes than natural twins. And that may be a socioeconomic thing as well. So it's a little better picture for the assisted reproductive twins than the natural twins. And finally, of course, not all that glitters is not gold. So all that glitters is not gold. So unfortunately, blastocyst cultures do have a slightly higher rate of the so-called monozygotic twinning, the identical twins. And those are actually higher risk than fraternal twins. So, you know, there's no perfect solution to these situations, but I think the only power you as patients have in this whole thing is we hear endlessly and understandably how one of the things that the infertile couples feel is that, you know, that they've lost control and power over what, you know, is done in the backseat of a car, right? You are sophisticated, educated, generally affluent people who have to give up control over what is a natural process. And the one thing you have control over is that decision on the day of the embryo transfer. And while I said there's no perfect solutions, the blastocyst occasionally will kind of mess you up with a monozygotic twin, overall, you're going to have less multiple pregnancies with that approach. And finally, some of the strategies just for the future, you know, we do a lot of PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Here in Australia, have excellent programs. I'm not in any way saying we're like hot shots or something, but we do have excellent PGD programs, and some people are using PGD to test the chromosomes of the embryos to make the intelligent choice of which embryo to transfer. That's an option. We are now involved in an FDA trial, a camera system that watches the embryos grow from day 1 to day 5, and they can accurately predict, even on day 3, which one embryo will be the best embryo, just by how they grow, without any invasive techniques. And if this pans out, it may be possible to do a day 3 transfer with one embryo, get the same pregnancy rate as a multiple embryo transfer, and have the decreased risk of monozygotic twinning as well. So these are things that are up in the future for us and available, and as you go through your journey, I hope that we'll be able to offer these things to you on a more regular basis. Thank you.
I know we're out of time, but I might take 1 or 2 questions if there are any, Dr. Twine.
When you talk about a PGD test, do you think there's a difference when it comes to success rate of pregnancy between PGD in day 3 to perhaps a ACGH in day 5 or 6?
Excellent question. The question was, is there a difference between biopsying the embryo on day 3 and day 5? It's hard to make that comparison because you have to know what would have happened if you hadn't done it, right? But we are moving towards the day 5 biopsies. So what the gentleman's asked about, when we can biopsy the embryo on day 3, We get an overnight answer. We can transfer a blastocyst on day 5 with the information about the chromosomes or genetics if there's a genetic disease. Or we can do it on day 5. So the benefit of that, we're not really interfering anymore with the embryo itself. There's now 100 cells, and we take the cells out of the part that's going to become the placenta, the trophoblast, and it probably is safer for the embryo, and we're probably getting more accurate results because of a condition, an 8-cell stage called mosaicism, which actually may be 2 cells in the same embryo with different chromosomes. And the embryos seem to correct that, and we think that we're getting probably less mosaicism reports by day 5. Here's the caveat, though, and I spoke to my colleagues even here at Genea about this. When you're coming all over the pond, as they say, to do this stuff, you may not have adequate number or adequately developed blastocysts on day 5 to do the biopsy, and then we have to go to day 6 and freeze it. So, if in a surrogate arrangement, it's actually not as bad as when we see people for donor eggs or gender selection, because those people have come over, they want to transfer, and hightail back, right? But in the surrogacy arrangement, at least, if we have to do a day 6 biopsy and freeze it, it's not so bad, right? The surrogate comes back a month later, we can do it. So at the moment, day 5 does seem to be where we're going, and for Australians and other overseas couples, they have to be flexible about the situation. So as I said, with our donor egg or gender selection, for overseas patients, we tend to do day 3 right now.
One of the things I don't think people are aware of is the difference between frozen embryo transfer and fresh embryo transfer is, with good quality eggs, is virtually negligible. And most people here are using good quality eggs. Right,
and I alluded to that. Thank you for that. The part of the mythology of what we do, first of all, technology does change, of course, and it improves. But besides that, you have to remember, you're not comparing apples to apples. When you do the fresh embryo transfer, you're generally putting in the best-looking embryos, and when you're freezing, you're kind of getting the some of the second-class citizens. And those second-class citizens will make you a healthy baby, and don't get me wrong. But you can understand why there would be a perceived drop in pregnancy rates with frozen embryos, because through the years, we froze everything. It's like, and the embryo, I'll say, if you put junk in the freezer, you get junk out. Now with particularly blastocyst cultures and vitrification, the newer freezing techniques, we're very selective in what we freeze. There's not that many embryos left, so out of a 28 case, you might get 4 or 5 embryos in the freezer. And so you're right, they're probably negligible. It would be hard to do the controlled study to prove that they're not different anymore. But you're right, and that's why I would urge you to see frozen embryos as a good backup system, an affordable backup system, a convenient one. Even if you want to come for the transfer, we do the transfer on Friday. The couples, it's a heck of a long trip to do this, but you can come. Every Australian comes, they tell me how hard they're working, and they can't take off time. So you can come, if you want to be there, you don't have to be there. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, if you want to be there, they come Thursday night, do the transfer Friday, and the parents are on the plane Saturday or Sunday, if they want to do it. So there are a lot of benefits to seeing that as a backup system to keep you out of the soup of a high-order multiple pregnancy.
Thanks.
Thank you.